The echo of 100 pairs of shoes shuffling down polished linoleum hallways, the squeak of sneakers, the laughter bouncing off cinder block walls. Then, swinging open those heavy double doors, you're greeted by the unmistakable symphony of the school cafeteria. Trays clattering, voices buzzing, and somewhere beneath it all, that blend of aromas you could never quite pin down. Was it tomato sauce? Was it something fried? Or maybe just the faint scent of overcooked green beans wafting through the steam?
A
The
melhor
1960s
merendeira.
school lunch wasn't just about feeding hungry kids. It was an entire ritual, a moment in the day where the classroom gave way to a world of trading, sharing, and sometimes quiet longing. You remember sliding your tray along those metal rails, each squeak and rattle building anticipation. Would it be the day you got sloppy joes, dripping with tangy sauce? Or maybe it was Fish Sticks Friday, where the crispy coating gave way to soft, mysterious white meat inside. And of course, you always had your eye out for dessert. Would today's Jell-O jiggle in a bright cherry red? Or worse, that lime green no one seemed to finish? For so many of us, these lunches stitched themselves into our childhood memories. They weren't gourmet by any stretch. Sometimes they were downright questionable, but they were ours. They were shared moments, flavored with laughter, whispers about weekend plans, or nervous chatter before a big test. Even the little details stick, the stubborn milk carton you couldn't open without mangling the corner, or the thrill of trading half a sandwich for a pudding cup. In this video, we're going to take a trip back, way back, to those cafeteria lines of the 1960s. Together, we'll revisit 25 of the most iconic foods that defined our school days. Some will make your mouth water, others might make you chuckle, and a few might just make you groan in recognition. But each one carries a story, a taste of a time when life felt simpler, and lunch was more than food. It was an experience. Sloppy Joes. If there was ever a food that perfectly matched the chaos of the school cafeteria, it was the Sloppy Joe. Picture it, a soft white bun barely holding together under a mountain of saucy ground beef, tangy with tomato paste, sweetened just enough and spiced lightly with onions and peppers. The moment the lunch lady plopped one onto your tray, you knew things were about to get messy. The smell carried down the line, warm, savory, and just a little sharp. And even if you weren't a fan, it announced itself like a marching band. Of course, the sloppy part was no exaggeration. Half of it landed on your tray, some of it made it onto your shirt, and if you were unlucky, a glob might hit your homework tucked inside your binder. Still, kids loved them because they were filling, cheap to make, and different from the usual meat and potatoes lineup. Sloppy Joes hit their peak in school lunches around the early 60s, when canned mixes like Manwich made the dish quick and cafeteria-friendly. But beyond the food itself, the Sloppy Joe carried with it a kind of playful freedom. You couldn't eat it neatly, so everyone looked equally ridiculous. Napkins stuck to fingers, sauce on cheeks, kids laughing across long tables. It was food that leveled the playing field, making even the most polished kid look like the rest of us. And that's why we remember it, not just for the flavor, but for the fun and the mess that made lunch feel alive. Fish Sticks Friday. Fridays had a certain magic in school cafeterias, and that magic often came breaded and golden brown. Fish sticks, lined up in neat rows on metal pans, were a universal signal that the weekend was almost here. They came out steaming, the crispy coating promising crunch, while the inside stayed soft and almost too mysterious to identify. Dip them in ketchup, tartar sauce, or sometimes just eat them plain. They were salty, hot, and oddly comforting. The smell, though, that was unforgettable. Fried oil and faint fishy steam drifted all the way to the playground doors. Kids knew instantly what day it was. Some loved it, others groaned, but nobody could deny Fish Stick Friday was a ritual. It wasn't just about taste, it was about tradition. There's also a cultural story here. During the 1960s, especially in Catholic households, Fridays were often meatless, so cafeterias leaned heavily on fish dishes to fit the times. Fish sticks were cheap, easy to store frozen, and could feed hundreds of hungry students without much fuss. Gorton's and Mrs. Paul's became household names because of this very tradition. Even if you weren't a fan, you probably remember the sound of that crunchy first bite, coating shattering in your mouth before the softer inside took over. And of course, there was always that kid who would stack 3 together and pretend it was a fish sandwich. Fish Stick Fridays weren't just food. They were part of the weekly rhythm, as dependable as the final bell and the promise of cartoons waiting at home. Meatloaf squares. Few things looked more school lunch official than a neatly cut square of meatloaf perched in the center of a beige tray compartment. Unlike at home, where meatloaf came in a comforting loaf shape, the cafeteria version was uniform, slice after slice, cut into perfect blocks like bricks waiting to be stacked. The top was usually brushed with a shiny ketchup glaze that caramelized under the heat lamps, giving off a sweet, tangy aroma that drifted down the line. The texture could be hit or miss, sometimes moist and savory, other times dry and crumbly, almost requiring a gulp of milk just to get it down. But for many, it tasted like home. The dish itself rose to prominence in American kitchens during the Depression and World War II years, when stretching ground meat with breadcrumbs and fillers became a necessity. By the 1960s, it was a budget-friendly classic, and schools leaned on it heavily. What made cafeteria meatloaf memorable wasn't just the flavor, but the ritual. The thunk of the serving spoon cutting into the pan, the sight of neat squares lined in rows, the steam rising as it landed on your tray. Some kids dreaded it, poking at it cautiously, while others dove right in, smothering it with extra ketchup. Either way, meatloaf squares were a constant, a dependable middle-of-the-week anchor. They may not have been glamorous, but they carried the reassuring sense of order. Every kid got the same square, the same taste, the same moment of chewing and chatting in the middle of the day. Turkey and gravy with mashed potatoes. Every so often, it felt like Thanksgiving showed up in the school cafeteria. On those special days, the tray would be loaded with a mound of mashed potatoes, a generous scoop of turkey slices, and a ladle of brown gravy that inevitably spilled into every other compartment. The smell alone, rich, savory, with hints of pepper, made the cafeteria line buzz with excitement. The mashed potatoes weren't always smooth. Sometimes they had lumps, sometimes they leaned a little too instant. But paired with salty gravy, they were pure comfort. The turkey itself often came in thin slices, piled high. Not quite like the roasted bird at home, but close enough to feel festive. And oh, the gravy! Cafeteria gravy had a mind of its own. It didn't just stay on the turkey, it seeped over onto your roll, your peas, and sometimes even touched your dessert. For many kids, this meal stood out because it felt bigger than the usual daily rotation. It was warm, hearty, and had a sense of occasion. Historically, school menus in the 1960s often tied into American traditions, reinforcing a sense of community and shared culture. Turkey and gravy was the kind of dish that reminded you of family gatherings, even in the middle of a busy school week. You left the cafeteria fuller on those days, not just in stomach, but in spirit. It felt like a small holiday tucked into the ordinary rhythm of arithmetic and spelling tests. Macaroni and cheese. And then, of course, there was macaroni and cheese, the golden star of comfort food. The sight alone was enough to kids cheer. Bubbling pans of elbow macaroni, coated in a creamy, sometimes slightly clumpy, cheese sauce that glowed under the cafeteria lights. The smell was unmistakable, sharp and rich, with that powdery tang that came from mixes like Kraft, which had already taken hold in American kitchens. Each bite was soft, yet chewy, the noodles soaking up the cheesy goodness. Sometimes it was perfectly creamy. Other times the sauce dried a little around the edges, creating crispy bits that kids either loved or scraped away. It didn't matter. Mac and cheese days were always a win. By the 1960s, boxed macaroni and cheese had become a staple in households, thanks to its low price, around 19 cents a box in the early part of the decade, and quick prep time. Schools adopted it wholeheartedly. It was filling, affordable, and universally appealing. What made mac and cheese so memorable was the feeling it gave. It was warm, indulgent, and comforting in a way few other cafeteria foods could match. You could poke at peas or ignore meatloaf, but mac and cheese? That was a dish kids devoured with smiles. And if you were really lucky, you'd trade an extra roll for a second scoop. It wasn't just lunch, it was a reminder that sometimes the simplest foods brought the greatest joy, uniting a noisy cafeteria full of hungry kids in silent appreciation. Peanut butter and jelly. Few lunches carried the same universal charm as the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You remember the sight: two soft slices of white bread, pressed together, edges slightly squished from being packed in a brown bag or slid on your tray. Open it up and there it was, sticky peanut butter clinging to the bread, grape or strawberry jelly shimmering like stained glass, oozing just enough to leave a little purple smudge on your fingers. The smell was sweet and nutty, and the taste was always a comforting mix of salty and sugary. It didn't matter if the bread stuck to the roof of your mouth, you knew the carton of milk would come to the rescue. By the 1960s, PB&J had become an American staple, especially as peanut butter soared in popularity after World War II. It was inexpensive, filling, and packed with enough protein to keep kids fueled through long afternoons. But beyond the flavor, it was a sandwich that felt safe and familiar. Whether you were the kid who always got it at home or the one trading for it in the cafeteria, PB&J was a constant friend. It didn't matter if life felt complicated in the classroom, long division, spelling bees, playground politics, PB&J was always there to smooth things over. It was simple, it was dependable, and for many of us, it tasted like childhood itself. Bologna sandwich. Then there was the bologna sandwich. Cheap, simple, and for some kids, an everyday occurrence. You'd see it as soon as the wax paper came off, one or two thin circles of pale pink bologna stacked on white bread, maybe with a slice of bright yellow American cheese if you were lucky. A squiggle of mustard or mayonnaise often completed the package, though sometimes it was just bread and meat, plain and straightforward. The smell hit before the taste, salty, tangy, unmistakably bologna. For kids in the 1960s, this sandwich was common because bologna was affordable and lasted long in the fridge, making it a practical choice for schools feeding hundreds of children. Oscar Mayer had already become a household name by then, their famous "Bologna" jingle ringing through homes not long after. For some, the bologna sandwich was a delight: soft bread, salty bite, and no fuss. For others, it was a dreaded trade item, always offered but rarely accepted unless paired with chips or a cookie. Yet, whether you loved it or not, you remembered it. Bologna sandwiches carried the smell, the texture, and the memory of school days where food wasn't fancy, but it did the job. There was also a strange charm to its simplicity. You didn't need to be rich to have one. Everyone, at one point or another, unwrapped that unmistakable circle of processed meat, and for better or worse, it became part of our shared lunchroom history. Grilled cheese. Now, when the cafeteria rolled out Grilled Cheese Day, that was a moment worth celebrating. Imagine golden brown bread with crispy buttered edges, the smell of sizzling margarine lingering in the air. Then came that first bite, the satisfying crunch giving way to gooey, melted cheese, stretching just enough to make you grin. Sometimes the sandwich was perfectly toasted, sometimes a little soggy from sitting under the heat lamps too long. But either way, it was comforting. Served with tomato soup on lucky days, it felt like a warm hug on a tray. By the 1960s, grilled cheese had already cemented its place in American homes, thanks to the growing popularity of Kraft singles, introduced in the mid-1950s. Schools quickly followed suit, finding it cheap, quick, and universally loved. The grilled cheese sandwich wasn't just about taste, though. It carried with it the memory of laughter at lunch tables, the trading of crusts for cookies, and the playful debates over whether ketchup counted as an acceptable dip. It was a food that felt indulgent yet simple, something even picky eaters rarely turned down. And when you got that perfect one, crispy, buttery, and oozing with cheese, it was the kind of cafeteria victory that could carry you through even the toughest math test later that day. Egg salad sandwich. If there was ever a sandwich that divided a cafeteria, it was the egg salad. The moment it hit the table, you knew it, thanks to that unmistakable sulfur smell drifting through the air. Creamy, pale yellow filling, speckled with bits of celery or onion, sandwiched between two slices of bread. Some kids loved it, savoring every bite, while others wrinkled their noses and hoped it belonged to the kid sitting 3 tables away. Egg salad had deep roots in American lunch culture, especially in the post-war years, when eggs were inexpensive and versatile. By the 1960s, cafeterias leaned on it heavily because it was cheap, easy to make in bulk, and offered protein without relying on pricier meats. But for kids, it was a gamble. Sometimes it was tangy and delicious, other times it was runny, soggy, and unappealing. Yet, despite the mixed reviews, egg salad sandwiches had a way of sticking in memory. You might recall trading it for chips or pudding, or maybe you were the one stubbornly defending it as underrated. It carried the humor of childhood negotiations, the whispered, "I'll swap you half my sandwich for your cookie deals," and the quiet solidarity of kids who actually enjoyed it. Whether you loved it or not, egg salad sandwiches embodied the unpredictable charm of cafeteria food. You never knew if it would make your day, or be the thing you tried to discreetly hide under your napkin. Either way, it was unforgettable. Ham and cheese on white. Ham and cheese on white bread felt like the most grown-up of the cafeteria sandwich lineup. Neat slices of pale ham, a square of processed American cheese, and soft, slightly sticky bread pressed together and wrapped in wax paper. It wasn't flashy, but it looked respectable, like something you'd imagine office workers eating at their desks. The first bite was always salty and slightly dry, with the cheese adding just enough creaminess to hold it together. Sometimes it came plain, other times with a dab of mustard or mayo, depending on the lunch staff's style. It was reliable, consistent, and a little more refined compared to bologna or PB&J. By the 1960s, ham was an affordable cold cut that many families kept stocked, and cheese was becoming more processed and convenient, fitting perfectly into cafeteria planning. Schools loved it because it was easy to prepare and served as a middle-of-the-road option, safe for picky eaters yet hearty enough to keep kids satisfied. Emotionally, ham and cheese sandwiches felt like a step toward maturity. Eating one almost made you feel older, like you were graduating from childhood favorites into something more serious. It didn't have the fun messiness of Sloppy Joes or the sticky sweetness of PB&J, but that was its charm. It was the sandwich equivalent of raising your hand confidently in class. steady, dependable, and just grown up enough to feel important. Chocolate pudding cups, 250 words. Few desserts could brighten up a tray like a little cup of chocolate pudding. You remember the excitement when you saw that glossy brown surface waiting for you, sometimes with that thin, pudding skin on top that kids either loved peeling back or groaned about. The smell was sweet and cocoa-rich, a promise of something creamy and indulgent hiding underneath. The texture was smooth and cool against the tongue, the kind of dessert you could savor slowly or finish in 3 big scoops before your buddy even picked up his spoon. Sometimes it was served in small glass or plastic dishes in the early part of the decade, later in those familiar little disposable cups with foil lids. Either way, it was a highlight, especially when paired with the clatter and noise of the lunchroom. Chocolate pudding became a cafeteria favorite in the 1960s as instant mixes like Jell-O pudding made preparation fast and cheap. At home, a box cost just a few dimes, and schools loved how easy it was to whip up for hundreds of kids. But the joy of pudding wasn't just taste. It was the moment of comfort it brought. Even if you didn't like the main dish, pudding was the sweet prize waiting at the end. It was one of those little luxuries that made the cafeteria feel less like an institution and more like a place where simple pleasures still had room to shine. Jell-O squares. Nothing made a cafeteria tray jiggle quite like Jell-O. Bright, wobbly squares in red, green, or orange appeared like little stained glass windows against the dull beige of mashed potatoes or meatloaf. One poke with a spoon sent it quivering, much to the delight of kids across the room. The taste was light, sugary, and fruity, but it was the texture that made it memorable, smooth, slippery, and just a little bit fun to chase around the dish. Sometimes the cafeteria staff got creative, adding fruit cocktail pieces inside. You never knew if you'd get a lucky cherry cube or an unfortunate mushy grape. By the 1960s, Jell-O was more than just food. It was a cultural icon. Advertisements promised a fun dessert for the whole family, and boxes cost mere pennies, making it a staple in homes and schools alike. Cafeterias leaned on it because it was cheap, easy to prepare in huge trays, and always guaranteed a reaction from kids. For many, Jell-O squares symbolized childhood innocence, something bright, playful, and a little silly in the middle of a serious school day. The wobbly dance of Jell-O on a tray carried laughter with it, whether you actually ate it or not. And admit it, there was always that one kid who couldn't resist shaking the table just to make everyone's Jell-O jiggle at once. Peanut butter cookies. Few smells traveled farther in a cafeteria than fresh-baked peanut butter cookies. Warm, sweet, and nutty, they often came marked with the classic crisscross fork pattern on top, golden brown with slightly darker edges. The first bite was chewy, soft, and just crumbly enough to leave a little trail on your lap. In the 1960s, peanut butter was at peak popularity in America, and schools embraced it. It was cheap, filling, and packed with protein. Recipes for peanut butter cookies had been circulating since the 1930s, but by this decade, they had become a lunchroom favorite, simple to make in bulk and always a crowd pleaser. The taste struck the perfect balance between salty and sweet, with just enough richness to feel like a treat without being overindulgent. For kids, these cookies were comfort in every bite. You might remember dunking one into your milk carton or saving it for last, treating it like the grand finale of the meal. There was also a social magic to them. Peanut butter cookies were easy to trade. Someone would happily swap part of their sandwich or a handful of chips to get their hands on one. And for the lucky kids whose birthdays landed on cookie days, it felt like the universe was sending a little gift. Even today, the smell of peanut butter cookies baking can transport you right back to that lunch line, waiting eagerly for your turn at the tray, hoping the batch hadn't run out yet. Rice Krispies Treats. Sticky, sweet, and oh so chewy, Rice Krispies Treats were one of those desserts that never lasted long on a cafeteria tray. The moment you picked one up, marshmallow strings clung to your fingers, leaving you licking your hands or wiping them on a napkin that never quite did the job. The taste was simple yet addictive, buttery marshmallow sweetness mixed with the light crunch of puffed rice cereal. Each bite gave a soft resistance, then melted into sugary satisfaction. The smell was faint but comforting, warm marshmallow with a hint of vanilla, the kind of scent that could make an entire lunchroom buzz with excitement. Though Kellogg's introduced the recipe in the late 1930s, by the 1960s, Rice Krispies Treats were a household and cafeteria staple. They were cheap, easy to whip up in huge pans, and beloved by kids. Wrapped tightly, they made their way into lunchboxes too, a sign of a parent's care tucked between sandwiches and fruit. But more than flavor, these treats carried a sense of fun. They were sticky, messy, and impossible to eat neatly, which made them all the more enjoyable. Kids compared who had the biggest square or the chewiest piece, and some even traded corners for other desserts. Rice Krispies Treats were proof that sometimes the simplest combinations created the most lasting memories. Just cereal, marshmallows, and butter, but together a childhood classic. Cupcakes with sprinkles. Few things made a school lunch feel like a celebration more than a cupcake topped with colorful sprinkles. Imagine it, a simple yellow cake base, fluffy and soft, crowned with a swirl of pastel frosting, pink, blue, or white, and finished with a cheerful scatter of rainbow sugar crystals. The sight alone brightened even the grayest cafeteria day. The first bite was pure joy. Soft cake, sweet frosting, and the crunch of sprinkles adding a playful texture. Sometimes the frosting was piled high, sometimes just a thin layer. But either way, it was a treat that made you feel like something special was happening. In the 1960s, cupcakes were inexpensive and easy for schools to make in bulk, often reserved for special occasions. Birthdays, holiday parties, or reward days often came with trays of these little cakes, handed out with a smile. They weren't gourmet by today's standards, but to a child, they were magical. Cupcakes carried more than sugar. They carried a sense of community. Everyone got one, and for a few minutes, the cafeteria felt like a party. Kids compared frosting colors, swapped sprinkles, or simply devoured theirs in seconds. And who could forget the simple joy of peeling back the paper liner, crumbs falling onto your tray as you carefully tried not to waste a single bite? Cupcakes were the great equalizer of the cafeteria, a sweet moment where everyone shared in the same little celebration. Milk cartons. Every school lunch tray in the 1960s seemed incomplete with one little cardboard carton of milk sitting in the corner. White or chocolate, it was the great debate. Did you get lucky with chocolate, or were you stuck with plain? The carton itself was a tiny puzzle box, folded neatly with a spout that never seemed to open cleanly. Kids pinched, pulled, or even tore the top completely off just to get a sip. The taste was simple, cold, creamy, and refreshing when it was fresh, or unforgettable in a whole different way when it had turned sour. That first gulp after a bite of peanut butter sandwich was a lifesaver, washing down bread that stuck stubbornly to the roof of your mouth. In the 1960s, milk was more than a drink. It was part of a national push for nutrition. School lunch programs emphasized dairy, believing it built strong bones and healthy kids. Cartons were cheap, uniform, and easy to hand out in bulk. But for us, milk cartons were a part of the rhythm of lunch. The sound of dozens being popped open at once, the little dribbles down the sides of the tray, or the mischief of kids blowing air back into them to make that popping balloon noise. Milk wasn't glamorous, but it was constant. A tiny box of everyday life we all remember struggling to open, sipping proudly, or sometimes trading away. Canned fruit cocktail. If you ever wondered what childhood in a dish looked like, it might just have been the canned fruit cocktail. Served in little cups or scooped onto trays, it was a rainbow mix of peaches, pears, grapes, and that one elusive red cherry that everyone secretly hoped for. The first bite was always slippery and cool. Soft pears, firmer peaches, the occasional mushy grape. And then, if you were lucky enough to snag a cherry, it felt like striking gold. So rare, it often sparked trades across the table. "I'll swap my roll if you give me the cherry" was a real cafeteria bargain. By the 1960s, canned fruit cocktail was a pantry and cafeteria staple. Canning companies like Del Monte and Libby's made it cheap, shelf-stable, and easy to serve in huge batches. It gave kids a dose of fruit, though often more sugar than vitamins. Still, fruit cocktail brought joy. Its sweetness contrasted the savory heaviness of meatloaf or turkey and gravy. It was a little splash of color on trays that otherwise looked beige and brown. And even if you didn't get the cherry, there was always that moment of anticipation, that tiny thrill as you searched through the syrupy mix. Fruit cocktail wasn't just food. It was a miniature treasure hunt on a school tray. Applesauce cups. Smooth, sweet, and just a little tangy, applesauce was one of those sides that managed to feel both like dessert and something healthy. Served in little cups or spooned directly onto trays, it had a pale golden glow, sometimes sprinkled with cinnamon, sometimes plain. The first spoonful was always cool and refreshing, the kind of bite that balanced out heavier foods like sloppy joes or fish sticks. The texture could vary, sometimes perfectly smooth, other times a bit chunky, with bits of apple that reminded you it started as fruit. And oh, the smell! Warm apple sweetness, sometimes spiced faintly if cinnamon was added. For many kids, it was a comfort food, something easy to eat and reliably tasty. Applesauce had long been a lunch staple in American homes, but in the 1960s, schools adopted it because it was inexpensive, easy to serve in bulk, and shelf-stable when canned. It gave the appearance of balance on a tray, a nod to health amid cookies and pudding cups. Emotionally, applesauce was one of those safe foods. Even the pickiest eaters rarely turned it away. It was sweet but not overwhelming, soft but not boring. You might remember stirring it slowly, mixing it into mashed potatoes on a dare, or saving it for the very last bite of your meal. It was the quiet hero of the cafeteria line, never flashy, but always there, bringing a little comfort to noisy lunch hours. Orange wedges. Sometimes simplicity won the day, and nothing felt fresher than a few bright orange wedges sitting on your tray. They glowed like little suns, their citrus scent cutting through the heavier smells of gravy and fried food. One bite, and juice burst across your tongue, sometimes sweet, sometimes mouth-puckeringly tart. Of course, oranges came with their own challenges. Peel stuck under your fingernails, sticky juice dripping onto your shirt, or the occasional surprise seed. But those things didn't matter much when you got a good, juicy wedge that felt like pure sunshine in the middle of a school day. In the 1960s, schools often used oranges as an affordable way to bring vitamin C into kids' diets. They were especially common in winter months, when parents remembered public health campaigns about fighting colds with citrus. Boxes of Florida or California oranges made their way into cafeterias across the country. Emotionally, orange wedges were more than food. They were refreshing breaks from monotony. They cut through the starchy heaviness of potatoes and meatloaf, adding a little zest, literally, to the lunch experience. And of course, oranges carried playground traditions too. Kids comparing who could peel one fastest or daring each other to bite into the rind. Simple as they were, those little wedges remain one of the purest, brightest memories of cafeteria days. Celery sticks with peanut butter. Crunchy, salty, and sticky all at once, celery sticks filled with peanut butter were a cafeteria attempt at health food that actually worked. The bright green stalks, cut into short lengths, came smeared with a generous line of creamy peanut butter down the center groove. Sometimes raisins were added on top, what kids nicknamed ants on a log. The first bite was a satisfying crunch, followed by the smooth, nutty filling that clung to the roof of your mouth. The contrast made it fun to eat, and even though celery itself didn't have much flavor, the peanut butter carried the day. By the 1960s, peanut butter had become a national obsession, and schools found creative ways to use it. Pairing it with celery checked two boxes at once, a vegetable and protein. It was affordable, easy to prepare, and gave kids something that felt different from the usual sides. Emotionally, celery with peanut butter stood out because it was interactive. You didn't just eat it, you crunched, chewed, and sometimes playfully scraped out the peanut butter with your tongue. Kids laughed as raisins rolled off or tried to stack multiple pieces together like little celery sandwiches. It wasn't the most glamorous side dish, but it was fun, memorable, and oddly satisfying. A little green, a little nutty, and a lot nostalgic. Twinkies. If there was one snack that carried a golden glow of childhood, it was the Twinkie. The sight alone, a spongy, golden yellow cake wrapped tightly in cellophane, could make a cafeteria tray feel like a treasure chest. You peeled back the plastic and were met with that faint, sweet vanilla scent, the promise of creamy filling hiding inside. The first bite was always soft and airy, the sponge cake giving way to that rich, whipped cream center. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't complicated, but to a kid in the 1960s, it was perfection. Twinkies had been around since the 1930s, but by this decade, Hostess had made them a lunchbox superstar, selling for just a few cents a pack. Twinkies weren't just food, they were currency. A single pack could buy you someone's bag of chips, a cookie, or even half a sandwich in cafeteria trade deals. There was a quiet thrill to pulling one out in front of your friends, like showing off a prized possession. And of course, Twinkies carried that sense of endlessness. Even back then, jokes circulated about how they could last forever on the shelf. To kids, that made them seem almost magical, indestructible, eternal, and always delicious. A Twinkie wasn't just dessert. It was a badge of luck, a little packaged joy that made even the gloomiest school day just a bit sweeter. Hostess CupCakes. Then there were Hostess CupCakes, the chocolatey cousin of the Twinkie, and arguably one of the most iconic snack cakes of the entire lunchroom era. You remember them, a round little cake, deep brown with glossy chocolate icing, topped with that famous white squiggle looping across the top. Just seeing it on a tray made kids lean in closer, hoping to catch a trade. The texture was rich and moist, with the creamy white filling hidden at the center like a secret reward. Some kids carefully nibbled the edges first, saving the middle bite for last. Others went straight for the center, tearing the cake in half just to expose the fluffy surprise inside. By the 1960s, Hostess CupCakes had already been around for decades, but advertising in this era made them shine even brighter. They cost only a dime or so and felt like pure luxury compared to plain fruit or cookies. In the cafeteria, they weren't just food, they were status. And you couldn't forget the sound of that crinkling wrapper or the little chocolate smudges left on your fingers. Eating one felt indulgent, like you'd somehow snuck in a piece of birthday cake in the middle of math class. More than a snack, the Hostess CupCake was a moment of joy wrapped in chocolate. And if you managed to trade for one, you walked back to your seat a little taller, knowing you'd just scored the crown jewel of school desserts. Fritos corn chips. Open a bag of Fritos in the cafeteria and you knew you weren't just eating, you were broadcasting. That salty, roasted corn smell filled the room instantly, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. The sound followed, that unmistakable crunch that echoed louder than any potato chip could manage. Fritos were bold, different. Each bite was hearty and rugged, with the kind of crunch that could survive even the thickest sandwich pairing. Introduced by Charles Elmer Doolin in the 1930s, by the 1960s, Fritos had exploded in popularity, thanks in part to clever marketing and their pairing with bean dips and chili. But in school cafeterias, they were usually just eaten straight out of the little yellow bag, handful after handful. They weren't as common as plain potato chips, which made them special. If you had a bag of Fritos, you had bargaining power. Kids swapped them for cookies, extra pudding, or even a Twinkie if you played your cards right. Emotionally, Fritos felt adventurous. They weren't smooth or delicate. They were crunchy, messy, and full of personality, much like the kids who loved them most. You might remember that sharp saltiness sticking to your fingers, leaving you licking every last bit. Fritos weren't just a side, they were an event. A snack that made sure everyone around knew you had something different, something bold, something worth remembering. Potato chips. Sometimes the simplest sides were the best, and plain potato chips held their ground as one of the most iconic. A crinkling wax paper bag revealed those golden curled slices, dusted with just the right amount of salt. They crackled with each bite, greasy fingerprints left behind as proof of your enjoyment. The sound of crunching chips was part of the cafeteria soundtrack. Each bite echoed louder than the chatter of the room, and somehow everyone knew who had the freshest bag. The taste was straightforward, salty, slightly oily, but addictive enough that the bag was always empty before you knew it. By the 1960s, brands like Lay's were dominating the chip market, selling small bags for a dime or less. Schools loved them because they were portioned, easy to hand out, and paired perfectly with nearly every sandwich on the menu. In the cafeteria, they weren't just food, they were status. And you couldn't forget the sound of that crinkling wrapper, or the little chocolate smudges left on your fingers. Eating one felt indulgent, like you'd somehow snuck in a piece of birthday cake in the middle of math class. More than a snack, the Hostess CupCake was a moment of joy wrapped in chocolate. And if you managed to trade for one, you walked back to your seat a little taller, knowing you'd just scored the crown jewel of school desserts. Fritos corn chips. Open a bag of Fritos in the cafeteria and you knew you weren't just eating, you were broadcasting. That salty, roasted corn smell filled the room instantly, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. The sound followed, that unmistakable crunch that echoed louder than any potato chip could manage. Fritos were bold, different. Each bite was hearty and rugged, with the kind of crunch that could survive even the thickest sandwich pairing. Introduced by Charles Elmer Doolin in the 1930s, by the 1960s, Fritos had exploded in popularity, thanks in part to clever marketing and their pairing with bean dips and chili. But in school cafeterias, they were usually just eaten straight out of the little yellow bag, handful after handful. They weren't as common as plain potato chips, which made them special. If you had a bag of Fritos, you had bargaining power. Kids swapped them for cookies, extra pudding, or even a Twinkie if you played your cards right. Emotionally, Fritos felt adventurous. They weren't smooth or delicate. They were crunchy, messy, and full of personality, much like the kids who loved them most. You might remember that sharp saltiness sticking to your fingers, leaving you licking every last bit. Fritos weren't just a side, they were an event, a snack that made sure everyone around knew you had something different, something bold, something worth remembering. What made chips memorable was their reliability. No surprises, no mystery fillings, just that satisfying crunch every single time. They may not have been flashy, but they were steady companions to peanut butter sandwiches, bologna on white, or even egg salad. Simple, salty, and oh so satisfying, potato chips gave lunch its rhythm. Devil dogs and snack cakes. And then there were the devil dogs, chocolate snack cakes filled with creamy white frosting, neatly packaged and ready to tempt every kid in the room. You peeled open the wrapper and were greeted with the rich scent of cocoa, the soft sponge giving way to that sweet filling with every bite. Made by Drake's, Devil Dogs were among a larger family of packaged cakes that included ringdings, yodels, and others. By the 1960s, they'd become fixtures in lunchboxes and cafeterias alike, selling for just a nickel or dime. They weren't just food, they were indulgence in a wrapper, a little escape from the ordinary. The texture was part of the fun, the slightly dry cake balanced perfectly by the creamy filling. Kids had different strategies. Some ate them fast, others carefully pulled them apart to savor the frosting. The sight of that wrapper on a tray always drew attention, sparking whispered trade offers across the table. Emotionally, Devil Dogs carried the thrill of having something store-bought, something polished and perfect compared to the homemade cookies or fruit cups. It felt modern, exciting, and just a little mischievous, like sneaking candy before dinner. Snack cakes like these weren't just desserts, they were symbols of childhood in the 1960s. Wrapped, portable, and instantly satisfying, they added sweetness to days filled with spelling tests and math drills. One bite, and the whole noisy cafeteria seemed just a little brighter.